to this course, Green Economy from China's Story. Now, let's turn to the second part of Chapter 10. The types of environmental policies. There are 4 types of environmental policies in practice. These 4 types are very popular both in the international community and China. The first type is the command and control environment policy. The second one is the market incentive environmental policy. The third is the public supervision environmental policy. And the fourth one is the voluntary release environmental policy. Okay, we will introduce them one by one. The first type of policy and the most widely used one is the command and control environmental policy. This one is the most traditional and the oldest environmental policy. It means that national administrative departments administrate directly and supervise mandatorily the production activities according to relevant laws, regulations, rules, and standards, including some compulsory measures, such as courts, policy, and fines, to make people abide by laws. In the command and control environmental policy, various types of standards are often relied on to improve environmental quality. According to the different effectiveness of various policy instruments, the command and control environmental policy can be divided into the following 3 categories. For China, the first category refers to national laws and regulations. Since China's formal enactment in December 1989 of the Environmental Protection Law of the People's Republic of China, we have made more than 30 laws and regulations on environmental protection. The second category refers to local laws and regulations issued by local governments at all levels. Local governments at all levels of the country have successively passed 84 local environmental laws and regulations. In addition, environmental protection departments at all levels and industrial organizations have also issued various kinds of environmental protection technology standards and systems, many including pre-process control systems such as environmental planning policy, environmental standards policy, environmental impact assessment policy, the 3 at the same time, 三同时 in Chinese, policy for investment projects, and the pollutant emission permit policy, and so on. Then, in-process standards and policy, such as pollutant emission concentration standards, total emission control standards, pollutant emission declaration and registration system, as well as post-relief pollutant emission, such as pollutant treatment within a prescribed time limit, emergency treatment policy for pollution accidents, supervision pollutant emission for illegal enterprises, and shutdown, merging or changing production line of firms. Among all the command and control environmental policies, standard is the most popular one. So why is the standard so popular? First, they set clear goals simply and directly. Secondly, standards are also in line with people's moral values. People usually think that pollution is a bad thing, so it is easy to implement a standard. Thirdly, the legal system is to define and prevent illegal behaviors. Standards formulated have these effects. So how many standard types are there? Can different standard types be used in combination? The most common standard type is the emission standard, followed by technical standard. The emission standard means that the emissions directly from the pollution source cannot exceed the specified emission standard. More specifically, there are standards for emission concentrations, such as regulation on concentration of BOD, biochemical oxygen demand. A major water pollution measure index refers to the concentration of BOD content. For another example, control on total residues, discharge rate, concentration and duration, etc., or on residues per unit of output, emissions generated per kilowatt-hour, residues per unit of input, and emissions generated by consumption of per ton of carbon. Last but not least, regulations on pollution removal rate, pollutant removal rate before waste emission, and so on. China has formulated corresponding different emission standards for firms manufacture different types of goods. In addition to the emission standards, there are also technical standards, and some standards actually do not specify final results, but specifying technologies, process, or practices that potential pollution causes must adopt. These are technical standards. For example, all electric power companies must install gas scrubbers to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. But strict environmental standards will increase more cost of production, which will bring about two general problems. First, the standard makers ignore the implementation cost, and the standard implementation personnel may choose a new standard to reduce costs. Second, local governments will adopt new standards flexibly to reduce implementation costs. Then an issue related to relationship between the central government and local governments arises. This is also a hot topic that has attracted wide attention in the academic field. Let's take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of command and control environment policy. Its advantages are that the environment protection is given priority, which is conducive to better control of environmental pollution sources. It is mandatory and timely, and its implementation cost is low. But its disadvantages are that it lacks flexibility and it is equivalent to specifying a clear lower limit for environmental protection. Incentives for technological improvements of enterprises are insufficient, and enterprises seeking technological improvements even will be defeated by those not pursuing improvements. Besides, sudden improvement for environmental technology standards may force enterprises to stop current investment projects and cause corresponding economic welfare loss to the society. According to the research by OECD, the command and control environmental policy has little effect in most developing countries. In China, in the process of the reform and opening up, the excessive implementation of command and control environmental policy have created a deep local government-business relationships, which affects the performance of environmental policies. Shortcomings of command and control environmental policy have been mentioned above. Although it is the most commonly implemented in China and has also been implemented for the longest time, another environment policy gets popular gradually, that is incentive-based environmental policy. What is an incentive environmental policy? The government authorities set the overall goals and rules first, and give enterprises enough space. The normal business motivation of enterprises is to make profit, so the government will guide them to adopt cost-effective pollution control procedures and technologies. The most typical incentives are pollutant charges and subsidies. What are pollutant charges? You can emit whatever residues you want, but your emissions will be measured. You have to pay for each unit of pollutant you emit. For example, in this figure, the enterprise shall pay for the noise pollution caused by it. According to the number of noise decibels exceeding the standard, the higher the number of noise decibels exceeding the standard is, the more the enterprise shall pay. The second common incentive is governance subsidies. What are governance subsidies? The subsidies here refer to a certain amount of fees that relevant government departments pay to the pollution causer for each ton of pollutant reduced. Starting from the baseline pollution level, subsidies here sound like the opposite of pollutant charges. The figure shows the standards for financial subsidies and incentives for early elimination of high pollution vehicles in Hainan province. Let's take a look at it. After introduction to incentive environmental policy, how do we assess the incentive environmental policy? According to the assessment standards mentioned earlier, can the efficiency stimulate enterprises' innovation? Let's take a look. In terms of efficiency, if all polluting enterprises accept the same pollutant emission fees, they will adjust their pollutant emissions so that the marginal principle will be satisfied. The marginal principle we are talking about here is MR equals to MC in microeconomics, which means marginal abatement cost should be equal to marginal income brought by marginal pollution reduction. At this time, the government only needs to formulate corresponding incentive policies. Then the enterprises will make spontaneous production adjustments so that the marginal principle will be satisfied. In other words, policies will be effective. Therefore, in terms of policy, the incentive-based environmental policy is superior to command and control environment policy, and it is more efficient. So can it stimulate innovation? General researchers find that the incentive-based environmental policy can stimulate enterprises to innovate. Through incentive environmental policies, enterprises will seek low-cost production methods and technologies to reduce pollutant emissions. Therefore, the incentive-based environmental policy can better stimulate enterprises to innovate than command and control environment policy. Does incentive-based environment policy have disadvantages? The disadvantages are that the intensive-based environmental policy lacks effective supervision. Compared with the command and control environmental policy, the incentive environmental policy relies on the principle of self-interested behavior of the enterprises. The enterprises generally act out of maximizing profit. It means the emissions within a certain range or even large amount pollutant emissions are allowed. Let's think about a question. Opponents of emission charge policy sometimes assert that they are simply a way of letting firms buy the right to pollute. Is this reasonable criticism? You can think about it. Thank you. See you next time.